implemented in 2018 in the first Trump administration. When Biden came into power, we all thought, oh, well, now that's done. We're not going to have any more Section 301 tariffs, thank goodness. That was not the case, surprisingly. Most of the Section 301 tariffs stayed in place. There were fewer exclusion processes granted. Surprisingly, for many consumer products were no longer subject to exemptions. There are a few exclusions that you can take advantage of now. As we had said, the solar and wafer the solar cells and wafer manufacturing equipment is still eligible through next year. There is the
Treasury finalized regulations on the 45X program, and not much has changed from the proposed regulations that were put out a year before. But one of the key sort of clarifications that were made had to do with what it means to be produced by the taxpayer. So this is a requirement in order to be eligible.
Is supply chain, solar supply chain, navigating evolving import compliance, which is especially poignant now after our recent election. There's a lot of speculation in the air, so it'll be good to get some clarity on these topics. Start with going over where the time will go in this webinar. We'll have 3 presenters today, James, Angela, and myself. James and Angela will start us off with 20 minutes each of a presentation, and then I will finish it off with a quick 5-minute presentation, jumping into Q&A after that. Just like our normal structure. We'll start with Angela. She is with ArentFox and helps companies with federal compliance as they try and import merchandise into the United States. She has a specific focus and leads the group in the forced labor compliance at ArentFox, and is currently having some technical difficulties. So hopefully she will be able to join us during this webinar, but we'll keep you posted on that. Our other speaker is James Kim, who is at ArentFox. He works on import and trade law issues. He has experience as a attorney consult with the U.S. Customs Border Patrol. So he has a deep background and understanding of this exact topic. So he is the guy to talk to, and helps clients with a myriad of different sectors, from PV to e-commerce to energy storage. So he is very, very knowledgeable on this exact topic. Oh, lovely. All right. I see that Angela has jumped in just in time.
I'm having technical difficulties, so I'm joining the phone, unfortunately.
No worries. I was just about to hand the floor over after introducing myself. So it's perfect timing. Last presenter will be myself. I'm the Director of Business Development at Sinovoltaics. I have a background in PV fabrication, and then some applied background in EPC contracting across the East Coast, primarily in PV. And then now I help at Sinovoltaics, working on helping our clients understand the technical side of due diligence when evaluating manufacturers and when trying to acquire assets. So that is what I do. Looks like you got some help there. All right, perfect. All right, so I will, unless there's any reason that I shouldn't, hand the stage over to Angela to jump us off with her presentation. Do you have a visual on the presentation? All good there?
I do, thankfully.
Wonderful, perfect timing, serendipitous.
All right. Sorry about all the technical difficulties this morning. Of course, we tested it earlier, it worked, and then now it doesn't. So
it's the world we live in. It's all good.
It's okay. And you made it. So that's important.
Well, thanks again for having us on your webinar today. James and I are really pleased to join you all in this really important conversation. So much is happening in the trade world right now. So much is happening in the clean energy world. So we wanted to give you a quick update on the developments that might impact you today, and then also going forward with the new administration. So we'll just start it right off.
Wonderful.
Rylan already kindly introduced us, so I will skip this. Both James and I work heavily in the clean energy industry. We work with many solar companies, with many energy storage companies and battery companies. So what we're seeing today is everything that you're experiencing every day. So we wanted to just give you some tips for the next few months, for the next coming year, and let you know what we're seeing now. This is our agenda for the day. It really encompasses what we've seen companies to be concerned about. So we'll talk briefly about the election and Trump's trade policy, the Section 301 tariffs and certain exclusions you can take advantage of right now, the anti-forced labor laws, IRA manufacturing incentives, and then of course AD/CVD and Section 201, which you've been dealing with for some time now. So to kick it off, Trump's trade policy. It seems like not very long ago that we were watching out for tweets at 5 o'clock on a Friday night and rushing to submit exclusion requests right after a holiday. And it seems like that will be happening again starting in January. So as many of you probably experienced, the first Trump administration was really marked by protectionism, unpredictability, and really the broad use of special tariffs. Of note was the Section 301 tariffs that was really used for the first time in a broad-based way. As I was just mentioning, this usually meant that companies had to pivot their supply chains very quickly. You didn't know who the next target was, and you really had to diversify your supply chain and leave or diversify away from China, because that seemed to be a target of the Trump administration in that first term. We expect, based on the campaign promises that were made, that we're going to see much the same in the coming year and in the next 4 years. And it seems like Trump is actually leaning even more aggressively into his protectionist trade policies. And he's going beyond China. While China is a special focus, it seems like no country is safe right now. And he is really leaning into tariffs as a negotiation tactic for America. So he has said that he's going to apply universal tariffs across the board. He campaigned on that. He said it was going to be 10 to 20% on all imports. We don't know that if that's going to be on top of the current standard tariffs or if that's going to be encompassed in the standard tariffs. Actually, much of what I'm saying right now, we don't know what will definitively happen, but we do know that tariffs or increased tariffs are going to happen. We really do expect that there is going to be an imposition of higher tariffs on goods from China. The Trump administration is going to be tough on China as a whole, and some of the people in his cabinet, some of his appointees are really telling in terms of what the strategy is going to be starting in January. He's also said that he's going to possibly revoke China's most favorite nation status. That would mean that for those of you in the trade world, your tariffs would go from the column 1 tariff to the column 2 provisions of tariffs. Right now, column 2, so that you have an example, includes Cuba, Belarus, Russia, and a couple other countries like Iran. So as you can imagine, the tariffs are going to be higher under that category too. I've been hearing for China, it was going to be between 30% to 100%, and there would be a ramp up period for that. Trump has also said that he's going to ban certain essential imports from China, so critical products for the United States. So if you are doing business in China, which I think most energy companies are in some way or form, particularly because most cells come from China, you should start thinking about this, planning for this, diversifying your supply chain, looking at options. In addition, there are now possibly going to be tariffs on our standard trading allies. Trump has said that he's going to impose tariffs on Mexico imports, and those would range from 25 to 100%. It would ramp up in 25% increments, and that would be really to persuade Mexico to stem the tide of illegal immigration, the migrants coming in from Mexico. He did, in his first administration, raise this possibility, but it was never implemented. I would say that based on his campaign promises, it's a more likely factor that this would be implemented this time. So for those of you that do business in Mexico, that's something that you should think about. And to that point, there is the USMCA renegotiations that are scheduled to occur in 2026. So to the extent that you do business in Mexico or Canada, you should watch out for changes to that program and to that special program. I think that the US is really going to use its powers of persuasion, its power to persuade Mexico and Canada to take actions in connection with forced labor, in connection with labor practices generally, and content or domestic content generally, to get what they want in this renegotiation. Trump has also said that he's going to implement increased tariffs on countries that no longer tie their currency to the US dollar. So that's not many countries, but some countries have looked into that. He has also said that he's going to impose company or product specific tariffs on companies that ship manufacturing out of the United States. As we know, the US has been struck with inflation. So there are certain companies like the John Deere company that has said that they were going to leave the United States. But Trump said that he was going to impose 200% tariffs. And as a result, they decided not to leave the United States. So that's something else to watch for. And of course, we can't take action without expecting other countries to take reciprocal action. And that's really where it could hurt us. So whenever we implemented tariffs, other countries also did so. Reciprocal tariffs should be expected in China, possibly Mexico, if we do implement these 25 to 100% tariffs, and then also the EU, which has sort of been on the list as well. In terms of non-tariff actions, well, I guess they are still linked to tariffs, but you've heard of many Chinese companies that are investing in plants in the North American region. There could be some restrictions in terms of Chinese ownership. There could also be restrictions on outbound investments. In terms of tariff reform, we do expect that there will be tariff exclusions that will be allowed if all these tariffs come into place. There were actually more tariff exclusions granted during the Trump administration than the Biden administration, which was somewhat surprising to many. So we can expect that there are going to be many tariff exclusion processes depending on the authority that Trump uses to implement these tariffs, depending on how long that they go. So expect the unexpected. That's what we're telling everybody. We have come up with certain strategies to mitigate those tariffs or the potential tariffs and ways for companies to protect themselves. So if you want to discuss that, please feel free to reach out to me or James on that matter. Section 301 tariffs. While we're talking about tariffs, these were first implemented in 2018 in the first Trump administration. When Biden came into power, we all thought, oh, well, now that's done. We're not going to have any more Section 301 tariffs, thank goodness. That was not the case, surprisingly. Most of the Section 301 tariffs stayed in place. There were fewer exclusion processes granted. Surprisingly, for many consumer products were no longer subject to exemptions. We can expect in the next administration that Section 301 tariffs are here to stay. There have been legal challenges to them. That's still going on in the courts. I think that we're going to continue to see them, and they may increase. That might be the authority that President Trump uses to implement higher China tariffs. We're going to have to see. So how does that impact all of you? Solar cells and modules from China are now subject to 50% tariffs under Section 301. This came about during the 4-year review that ended this fall, and the results were announced this fall. Starting in January of 2025, solar panel parts of this tariff classification or this tariff provision are also going to be subject to 50% tariffs. So that is really due to the Biden administration wanting to encourage domestic manufacturing. James is going to discuss the IRA in a moment, but all of these are really to protect the emerging domestic industry and encourage domestic manufacturing. In terms of exclusions, those are also intended to encourage domestic manufacturing. So there are 14 exclusions that have been granted for solar wafer and cell manufacturing equipment. This was a little bit unique in that there wasn't a comment period to request this equipment, or not the traditional comment period. It was granted. And it was retroactive to January. So for those of you who have imported solar wafer and cell manufacturing equipment, you may be able to receive refunds on the tariffs that you've already paid. And there are different methods of doing that. You can do it via PSC or protest. Let us know if you need help with that. Those exclusions are going to be effective until May 31st, 2025. So that gives companies the opportunity to import from China solar manufacturing equipment to help support their domestic manufacturing. We're not sure under the new administration if there will be a process to extend that exclusion. There might be. It's a relatively short window of time, this exclusion. So to the extent that you're planning to manufacture in the United States, I would certainly try to import those goods or those pieces of equipment as soon as possible. What else is happening for Section 301? So the USTR is currently accepting comments for proposed machinery exclusions to support domestic manufacturing. So this equipment, again, is in chapters 84 and 85. There is certain equipment for the solar and clean energy industry that seems to fall under provisions that are included in this exclusion process. So again, to the extent that you're planning to start up domestic manufacturing in the coming year, I would apply for those exclusions. It's happening on a rolling basis. The comment period is open through March 31st, 2025, but USTR is periodically reviewing and making its determinations. Now, given that the exclusion is only going to be until mid next year, I would try to submit these comments as soon as possible so that you have time to actually take advantage of those exclusions. Now, lastly, in response to domestic industry, the USTR has proposed a 50% Section 301 tariff on polysilicon and wafers. The comment period on that is closed, and we're awaiting USTR's final decision. But I'm sure that once that decision is published, James and I will be sending out an alert for publishing the results of that review. More tariffs. As part of that section or 301 4-year review, President Biden and the USTR announced certain tariff increases on certain strategic goods. Here we have outlined the products that we think would be of interest to this group and that might impact you. As you can see here, many of these Section 301 tariffs went into place already as of September 27th, 2024. And then for semiconductors, it's coming into place in January 1st of this coming year. And lithium ion non-EV batteries are coming into place in 2026. And that's really to give the domestic industry time to ramp up production in the United States. So watch out for this. We don't know if this is going to change in the next administration. If anything, I'd expect that these tariffs are going to increase rather than decrease in the next administration. So to the extent that you can, I think many companies are starting to import what they can into the United States. They're putting them in bonded warehouses and then importing them right before President Trump comes into power. So that's something you might want to think about as a tariff mitigation strategy. There are a few exclusions that you can take advantage of now. As we had said, the solar cells and wafer manufacturing equipment is still eligible through next year. There is the exclusion process on Chapter 84 and 85 machinery. Take a look at that list. It's by HTS code. And if you need help with that, we're happy to advise you on that. And then there are certain exclusions that have been reinstated through May 31st, 2025 that this group can take advantage of. Those might include certain glass used for solar production and then certain junction boxes of, I believe it's 1500 voltage. So you should take advantage of those while you can. Forced labor. This is a topic that I advise on quite heavily, and I know that many that are attending this webinar today are concerned about. The solar industry, the battery industry are really under scrutiny for forced labor because of the heavy reliance on a Chinese supply chain. As you know, there have been many NGO reports on this topic. There have been a lot of detentions on this, based on forced labor that have impacted this industry. So a lot of this stems back to the fact that polysilicon is largely sourced in China. And for a long time, over 35% was from the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, which is the focus of the UFLPA, which came into place a few years ago. In 2021, before the UFLPA came into place, a withhold release order was issued on Hoshin Silicon because this is a large producer of polysilicon and they did business in Xinjiang. The UFLPA superseded that WRO, and now forced labor detentions are largely made through the UFLPA processes. This NGO, the Sheffield Hallam University, has issued a couple of pretty scathing NGO reports on the industry, saying that there is a connection to Xinjiang, but really that's by virtue of the fact that solar supply chains are just tied to China because infrastructure has been built in China over many years, and no other country really invested the same way China did. So unfortunately, these Sheffield Hallam reports are used by customs heavily in determining what companies to target, what supply chains and products to target. So if you haven't reviewed these reports, I would encourage you to do so and make sure that your supply chain doesn't have a link to those companies and those reports, because that'll be a higher risk of forced labor detention. I will warn you that just because a company is on that report doesn't mean that they truly have a tie to forced labor. Some of this information is really based on vague connections or unverified connections. However, unfortunately, CBP sort of reviews these NGO reports, and because they don't have their own investigatory arm, they really rely on them on determining what to target. The last thing I would note on this slide is that many solar companies received U.S. Customs and Border Protection questionnaires about their supply chains last spring. And these questionnaires asked pretty extensive questions regarding both the companies, their supply chains, and then their suppliers' operations and labor practices. They required a lot of information in terms of tracing documentation so that companies would prove the companies that are in their supply chain. It was a very heavy lift. We expected Customs to come out with the results of that last summer because they said they were going to. But we have not heard any of the results from that. So we are still pending what may come out of those questionnaires. But it was really intended to verify the information that companies could obtain from their supply chain, and then also to verify that suppliers who said that they were actually producing certain materials were producing those materials. I'm just going to go over this very quickly. You will want to make sure that you have processes in place to conduct supply chain due diligence to avoid a detention, because if you are subject to a detention, and many electronics companies have been, which I'll show you in a moment, this is what you're going to need to produce for every single tier of your supply chain. So everything from quartzite to the finished panel, you're going to have all the transaction documents, the production documents, transportation documents, and flow charts of the production processes that show that there is no nexus to Xinjiang. It is a heavy lift. It's often thousands of documents, requires a lot of translation. So if at all possible, I would do diligence to avoid a detention. Similarly here, Customs is also focusing on the battery industry. They actually issued a special addendum for both solar and batteries last year because there were so many detentions in those spaces. And they listed, and we put the link here, the information that would be required in order to potentially secure release. So in terms of enforcement, it seems like the solar industry, electronics as a whole have been heavily the focus of Customs enforcement actions. That's partly because polysilicon, solar were part of the UFLPA target lists, and this here shows a snapshot of the U.S. Customs and Border Protection enforcement statistics around detentions. As you can see here, electronics are number one by far. It's only lagged behind by apparel, footwear, and textiles. So the vast majority of detentions are in your space. As we understand it, solar encompasses much of that electronics number, but other electronics are starting to creep up in there as well. So things like batteries and just general consumer electronics as well. So keep that in mind as you structure your forced labor programs. Here on the right, you can see that more than half of the overall detentions since June 2022 are related to the electronics industry. While 3,000 shipments have been released, over 1,500 are either pending or have been denied because the importers couldn't prove that there was no nexus to Xinjiang. Now, here are the enforcement statistics by country. Many companies think that if they don't do business in China or they don't export directly from China, then they're safe. It means that they don't have a nexus to Xinjiang, and they won't be targeted. These statistics clearly show that's not the case. CBP is able to connect final production to Xinjiang in some way. They're using all these AI technology targeting tools, so they are able to link supply chains that could be problematic. If you compare these statistics side by side, you can see that most of these detentions are connected to electronics and solar, and in certain countries, they make up most of the detentions. For example, Malaysia, if you look at it, overall detentions are 1.56 billion. For electronics, it's 1.54 billion. And then if you look at, say, Thailand, it's 0.52 billion for both, which tells me that most of the detentions out of Thailand are electronics focused. I'm also hearing that now Malaysia, there are a number of clean energy related, I'm sorry, not Malaysia, Mexico. There are a number of clean energy related detentions coming out of Mexico, and CBP continues to detain. So you'll have to make sure you do supply chain due diligence regardless of where your final production occurs. These are the enforcement statistics. I won't go deep into it, but same thing. Most are electronics, and you can see here by month the targeting that is occurring. So what happens if you don't comply with the UFLPA, if you don't do supply chain due diligence? Regardless of the headache of a detention, there are other repercussions as well. So termination of contracts, breach of contract, you won't be able to fulfill your manufacturing schedules. There are really high demurrage fees. I've heard in the millions, and it could really cause a disruption to your manufacturing schedules in the United States to the extent that you're importing materials. And the problem with all of this too is that shipments could be continuously detained. So just because you get one shipment through a detention doesn't mean that subsequent detentions won't occur. There's also reputational harm, which is really important to all of you. You don't want to be in the news. You don't want to be on the New York Times. You don't want to be the subject of an NGO report. To date, Customs has not issued penalties or used the criminal provisions in connection with forced labor, but we expect that they might in the future, particularly for goods that are exported because companies can't prove that there's no nexus to Xinjiang, and then somehow those same goods re-enter the United States. There are multiple ways to reduce the risk of forced labor in supply chains. I don't have much time, so I won't go deep into them, but essentially you want to map your supply chain and conduct supply chain due diligence to ensure that you have no nexus to Xinjiang or a problematic supplier. Problematic supplier could include any entity on the DHS entity list as well. And there are many entities listed on there related to the clean energy supply chain. So take a look at that. I'm going to turn it over to James.
Thanks, Angela. By the way, it's a pleasure to be here today on this webinar with Sinovoltaics. I'm going to be covering a couple of things that may be top of mind for you. One is the first one being the Inflation Reduction Act and its incentives for solar and clean energy manufacturers. And then I'm going to turn to some of the trade remedies that have been affecting the solar industry in particular. So let's get started. So there's been a lot of questions swirling around this about the fate of the Inflation Reduction Act. This was a major climate bill that was put into effect in 2022. I think over $380 billion was earmarked for various clean energy projects and incentives. And what we've heard from Trump during the campaign trail is that he's not a fan. So we'll see what happens, and I'm going to address this a little bit later. But the IRA incentives that I'm going to focus on are the ones for manufacturers in the US specifically for solar, battery, and other clean energy plants and projects. And the two that are of note that you should be aware of are the 45X incentive and the 48C incentive. And many of the manufacturers that we're talking about will actually be eligible for both of these incentives, but you can only really use one at a time. So if you qualify for both, you can use one, but not the other. And I guess starting with the 45X incentive, this is a credit that's awarded for producing certain types of clean energy components, including, for solar and wind energy, as well as battery components. And the amount of the credit will vary depending on the type of component. And it's basically calculated based on the number of units that are produced by the manufacturer. And so this is an upfront credit that's issued, and it's based on the number of units that you actually produce. The 48C credit works a little bit differently, and this is an upfront tax credit that's issued for manufacturers that are either requipping, expanding, or basically establishing a manufacturing plant for clean energy components, including, again, solar and battery. What's different about this credit is that there's a cap of $10 billion and what can be awarded. And so it's a highly competitive grant program that's administered by the Department of Energy. And it's not enough to just meet the eligibility requirements. The DOE is going to award these credits based on, whether or not that project or that plant is going to address a certain critical supply chain gap, right? And right now, the second round of funding applications is already closed, and the DOE is looking at those applications now. So as I said, if you're a facility that qualifies for both of these credits, you can claim one but not the other. The other thing to note is that you can qualify for the 45X on an existing plant, but in order to qualify for 48C, it has to be basically a new investment. On this slide, it just shows you some examples of how the credit amounts under 45X are calculated for solar components. And as you can see, it either depends on the amount you produce or the capacity that's produced in the case of, for example, PV cells, the capacity of energy that's produced there. So what's the latest on this? Well, in the last year, actually just last month, Treasury finalized regulations on the 45X program. And not much has changed from the proposed regulations that were put out a year before. But one of the key sort of clarifications that were made had to do with what it means to be produced by the taxpayer. So this is a requirement in order to be eligible for this tax credit. And under the proposed regulations, produced by taxpayer meant that what you're producing has to undergo something called substantial transformation. Basically, the inputs that you are bringing into the US have to be substantially transformed into a new type of product. And there were a lot of questions that came out of this as to what that really means. I know from a US customs standpoint, both Angela and I do a lot of customs law. There's been a lot of guidance and rulings and case law about what substantial transformation means under that context. But it's a new concept under the tax laws, under the IRA. And so there's been a lot of questions about what that really means. And the new regs, or the finalized regs, added some explanation as to this, and made one clarification about whether assembly would be enough in the case of solar products. And that rule did say that for solar modules, which are really involving assembly of different components, including cells, there would be a substantial transformation. So at least in that context, we know that that assembly of a solar module would meet that requirement to be eligible for this 45X credit. On the 48C front, again, as I mentioned, the applications for the second round of funding, which involves $600 billion that's allocated for these projects, that application process has closed, and we should expect the final decisions to come out no later than January of next year. So what's the future of the IRA? I think that's sort of the big question for everyone, especially for the manufacturers that are kind of depending on these incentives. Trump has said again on the campaign trail that he considers the IRA to be a scam, and he's promised that he'll try to basically see if he can roll it back. But we think that it would actually be pretty difficult for Trump to actually repeal the IRA in its entirety, because there's been studies that have come out that a lot of the IRA funds are actually being sent to red states or Republican states, or the districts, the red districts that are in maybe blue states. So what that means is that if Trump actually tries to repeal the IRA, especially when it comes to these types of incentives, he's probably going to get a lot of pushback from Congress, because a lot of Republicans there, their constituents are depending on these incentives, and a lot of the funds have already been allocated to these states. So what might Trump do sort of in short of repealing the entire IRA? I think he could maybe rescind some of the unspent funds that have not yet been allocated. Maybe certain provisions in the IRA could go away. I think that personally these incentives are likely to be safe, but there's been a lot of discussion about the EV consumer tax credit, which Trump is not a fan of, and it's possible that that particular incentive could go away. Another thing that he could do, or with Congress that they could do, is that they can make eligibility requirements a little bit more narrow for some of these provisions. And I'm speaking particularly of the 45X credit, which doesn't have a limitation on sourcing from countries like China, which has been known as this foreign entity of concern restriction. But there's been proposals to put a restriction like that in place. So I'm going to move very quickly through the next few slides, sort of given the time we have. But anti-dumping and countervailing duty orders and investigations, this has been heavily impacting the solar space. And I'm not going to go through the whole background here, but there's been a new case that's been filed in the past year against Southeast Asian countries. And we're talking about Cambodia, Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam in this case, for solar modules and cells that are produced in those countries. And so this case is under the investigation stage. The International Trade Commission has put out some preliminary findings showing that there has been injury to the domestic industry as a result of the import surge from these Southeast Asian countries. These are some slides that kind of talk about how U.S. manufacturing plants, many of them have basically been or not actually taking place because of the fact that these the imports from Southeast Asia has significantly depressed prices in the U.S. This is the investigation schedule, and as you can see, if it goes according to schedule, and both Commerce and the ITC come out with affirmative findings in their investigations, then we will have a final AD/CVD order in June of next year. And this is a slide here that just compares the different investigations that have taken place in the solar space over the last decade or so, and sort of the scope of each of those investigations. And finally, I'm going to conclude our presentation with a little bit on the Section 201 safeguard tariffs. Again, this is a set of tariffs that affects solar products, and they came out of actually the Trump administration the first time around, and these were tariffs that are not country specific. So they're broad special tariffs that are imposed on solar modules and cells coming from any country with certain exceptions for certain countries. But basically what they involve are increased tariffs of up to 30%, at least initially when they came out, on both solar cells and modules, which have been decreasing annually, which means that in this year, in 2024, the tariffs are actually 14.25%. And in the case of solar cells, they're actually under what's known as a tariff rate quota. So what that means is that up to a certain amount of imports, those cells can come in duty-free. But once they exceed a certain amount, tariffs are owed. The 201 tariffs are owed. And these Section 201 tariffs are going to be here until February of 2026. So in the last year, there's been a few new developments. I think the key one that's been key that happened in May of this last year is that the bifacial tariff exemption went away. So before May of this year, bifacial modules were actually exempt from these 201 tariffs. And as a result of that, what we were seeing was that actually most solar modules that were being imported were actually bifacial modules. And there was a petition filed to basically get that exemption removed because the US industry was saying that it was hurting their production. And therefore, Biden agreed, and that exemption was rescinded in May of this year. So 201 tariffs apply to those. And then, as I mentioned, there's a tariff rate quota on cells, solar cells, and the ceiling for that has gone up from 5 gigawatts annually to 2.5 gigawatts. So what that means is, starting from August of this year, importers could import up to 12.5 gigawatts annually of solar cells before they have to actually pay the 201 tariffs. And this slide here just kind of summarizes everything that I mentioned here regarding what's covered and sort of the relevant dates and the tariff rates and quotas involved. So that's kind of it for our presentation. We can shift over to any questions that the audience has.
Wonderful. I will speed run through my side of the presentation real fast. I know we have a lot of questions in chat that I want to get to. So I will run through this really quick. A lot of the things on the Sinovoltaic side are going to reiterate what you just heard. There are a lot of barriers to go through, a lot of compliance to think of when you're looking at ordering from different suppliers all over the world. And it all starts with the contract, making sure that you have language in your contract that protects you from shifts in suppliers, that shifting tariffs, things like that. All of these things, you have no strength in any of your actions unless it's backed up in your contract. I'm sure our experts would agree. In any procurement, there is different levels that you can have when you're scrutinizing your supply chain. So when you're selecting your manufacturer, you're obviously going to go through due diligence. As Angela mentioned, there are a lot of studies that outline lists that are on these that have been flagged or been stopped in the past by US customs. And so going through those, doing your due diligence and making sure that your suppliers and your sub-suppliers are not on that list can be done on a desktop. There are plenty of consultants that help with that. Sinovoltaics does. Our experts do as well. So that's the first line of defense, making sure that you have all the low-hanging fruit, making sure that you understand what has happened in the past so it doesn't happen in the future. The next thing is, once you have your short list of manufacturers, you've looked at the risk, you've figured out which manufacturers on the surface have acceptable risk that you are willing to take on. You then go to the manufacturer to make sure they have standards in place that that would verify that this risk is not going to be injected into your equipment down the line. So making sure that they have frameworks in place to record all of the information that could be required if your shipment is detained. So they have a strong archive of the documents, bills of lading, transport, all of these documents. Making sure that incoming QA/QC and outgoing QA/QC are tracked diligently, so you know what materials are coming from where, so that none can sneak into your batch of equipment without you knowing about it, and then be flagged later down the line at the ports. So this is kind of the level 2 of scrutiny, boots on the ground, auditing manufacturers. The last level of scrutiny will be to physically have boots on the ground during the production of your equipment. So your order has been placed and the manufacturer starts to manufacture that equipment. Having people on the ground to make sure that the materials that you have specified in your contract that are allowed from the region in that composition are allowed into your equipment is actually what's going in. So you have full transparency about the actual full composition and origin of your equipment, so there'll be no surprises. At this stage, you will have full understanding of the bill of material, so you can pull all the background documentation if you would like to have them prepared for US Customs. And it can already be set up in the way that Customs likes to look at these documents, so that would expedite your way through any stoppages that could happen during the importation process. So this is kind of, it looks like really, really straightforward. There are a lot of issues, a lot of barriers to think about. Doing desktop due diligence is the first place to start. Speaking with experts in the field who work through these contracts, work through legal review. ArentFox obviously has proved their expertise today. Then doing on-site due diligence, whether that be audits before manufacturing or inspections during manufacturing. Once all of these things are in place, then you can almost guarantee that you will have no issues going through US Customs. And if you do, then you can guarantee that you'll have the paperwork required to make that transition as smooth and as time efficient as possible. So it's, I mean, it's straightforward once you lay it out like this in 6 boxes, but it's not as straightforward in real life. So good thing we have all these experts to work with. That's some information about us, but we will jump into QA for the last 5 minutes. There are some questions here, and they've nicely already been highlighted for Mr. Kim. We'll start with this one. What is the import duty situation today? And after the changes of the president in the US election regarding the imports of solar cell production in Germany for the photovoltaic module manufacturing in the USA? Myers-Briggs case. This is Europe specific, so.
Yeah, happy to answer this question from Stefan, I think. So it sounds like what you're asking is what are the duty rates on solar cells from Germany that are going to be used in module production in the US. And I think that would depend on what the origin of the cells are. So if we assume that it's just Germany, then the rates that would apply are the standard rate, and then the 201 rate. The 201 rate, as I mentioned in 2024, is 14.25%. However, if it's imported while it's still under quota, right, as we mentioned, so up to 12.5 gigawatts of cells, starting in August of this year, can be imported duty-free, right? So if it's being imported in that period, then it's actually duty-free under the 201 tariff. But then beyond 2.5 gigawatts in that year, then the 201 tariff would apply. But as I said in the beginning, what matters there is to know what the origin of the cell is, because just the fact that it's actually coming from Germany doesn't mean that it's necessarily German origin, right? So if those solar cells incorporate, for example, Chinese wafers, then it's possible that the origin of the cells could be China, which in that case, some of the other trade remedies that we mentioned could apply, such as the Section 301 tariffs, which are going to be 50% on solar cells. And then even the AD/CVD orders could potentially apply to those solar cells. As you can see, it's always a complicated question when it comes to tariffs, because it often depends on the origin, and that origin can depend on a test, something like such as substantial transformation, whether there's been enough production in that country in order to change it to the origin of that country.
It's always complicated. This kind of leads into this next question from Brian. Is India safe for procurement? Which I think is kind of on the broader spectrum of what locations or regions might be safest to purchase from, with shifting circumnavigation and countervailing duties being implemented kind of in a rolling effect. Do either of you guys have any insight on regional safety?
Are we talking about for what? For forced labor? For tariffs? For
let's go. Let's go like heavy tariffs for PV. I think the UFLPA is pretty outlined. You have to dig back into your supply chain, but from the circumnavigation and countervailing aspect.
I don't know, James, what you think, but we're hearing that India could be one of the next countries targeted too, since some companies are moving to India or moving production to India.
Yeah, I think that a lot of companies that they're aware of this investigation in Southeast Asian countries, so they're moving their solar like wafer or cell production to other countries such as India, Indonesia. I've heard Turkey as well. I don't think that, sort of at our beginning of our presentation, we've said that there's probably no country that is safe, right? So it's always possible that a case could be filed against India. But it's a little bit hard to predict at this point, right? So it just depends on kind of the state of U.S. manufacturing and whether the domestic industry would be sort of motivated enough to go through that, because these cases, these 80s, especially the AD/CVD cases, they're massive cases. They go on for years. It's a lot of investment, but yeah, it kind of remains to be seen, I think.
Yeah. Yep, definitely agree. Also, I think to your point, a timeline thing, I think there's periods of safety. Whether or not every country will have these enacted is an open question, but all right, we have a question about batteries. I think Angela answered in the chat, but Angela, do you want to give thoughts on if these things are applicable for batteries as well? Maybe start with UFLPA forced labor.
Sure. For forced labor, they are. It's the same types of documentary requirements and due diligence requirements that you'll have to fulfill. In terms of Section 301, we also outlined some of the Section 301 tariffs applicable for battery and energy storage systems as well. And then I think the AD/CVD and 201 doesn't apply right now to batteries, so don't worry about it for those purposes. But in terms of the tariff, other tariffs, they do apply.
This is my own personal question. Do you think, and we'll wrap up very soon, do you think that batteries will come under a similar scrutiny that PV has gone through in the next coming years? I know most of them are coming out of China, so I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
Right now, there isn't really a domestic industry to file these cases. Perhaps with IRA and with the progression of the domestic infrastructure, that could happen. But I think it's going to take a while because it just doesn't exist yet. James, I don't know if you have thoughts on that too.
Yeah, that's basically what I was going to say. I don't think that the battery industry in the U.S. is mature enough to, at this point, to bring a petition like the solar industry has. But that could change, and I think as the battery industry develops, I think they will also be seeking probably protectionist measures, and they'll probably find a favorable government to be able that would support that, right? So that's always possible, and something to keep an eye on. Rylan, I noticed there was a question by Dino as well, related to EU products.
You want to take it on?
Yeah, sure. I think the question was about whether or not EU solar panels and batteries will also be affected by some of these trade measures. I know that the Trump administration is kind of targeting the EU in terms of trying to address the trade deficits that have sort of emerged out of U.S. and EU trade. I think in particular, Trump has kind of eyed or sort of looked at Germany as one country where there's a more significant trade deficit. I haven't heard that the solar or battery industries in particular being targeted coming out of the EU. I mean, we know that there's like digital trade issues with the EU, and in particular, Trump thinks that the EU has higher tariffs on U.S. products and therefore wants to maybe impose reciprocal tariffs on the EU imports coming into the U.S. So that's something to look out for, but I haven't heard anything specifically about EU solar panels or batteries being affected specifically for trade remedies.
Got it. Perfect. Well, we have gone over time a little bit, so I will thank our expert panelists. Thank you guys so much for joining us, and thank you for everybody else who has joined us on this webinar today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
Bye.
Visit Sinovoltaics.com to learn more.